Since a very young age, I was taught in school that we Dominicans are a mixture of three races: Spanish, Taino, and African, and that we are Latin Americans. That aspirational Latinidad and mestizaje was a key part of the Dominican identity, but I knew it didn't add up because of who I am, black. And the majority of the population in the Dominican Republic is black, and our culture is mostly black. Then, when I started traveling to other Latin American countries, I was met with comments of how good my Spanish was by surprised Colombians and Mexicans, and also how very few people outside of my country acknowledge that we were one of the first islands visited by Columbus, and how we have the first cathedral and university of quote unquote the New World. Facts that used to fill me with pride when I was young, naive, and before reading the gospel of the colonial theory and history. Outside the imaginary of the real Latinidad, I didn't exist because of my blackness. It took me meeting other Latinos from other countries to realize that I am not Latina and that I will never be. And the sad thing is that reality was always on my face. I grew up watching Mexican telenovelas where the cast is mostly white except for the servants. I also grew up watching Brazilian telenovelas where almost all the cast is white Caucasian Europeans, blonde, colored eyes, and also I grew up watching the Telemundo telenovelas that were the groundbreaking representation of the Latino community and voices in the United States, where everybody was white, except, of course, for the servants. Under the shadow of the aspirational whiteness that there is in the mestizaje, as an approximation of whiteness, that is the colonial construction, that is La Latinidad, there are not only indigenous communities, but also black people, which are the groups that get the most cultural and territorial extractivism. This is why the only definition I accept of Latinidad is this one. Latinidad is a fabricated geopolitical identity that contains the complexities of immigration, colonialism, legal status, class, some nations, one language, and erases black and indigenous experiences. This was written by Miguel Salazar in the opinion piece The Problem with Latinidad. We black Latinos have been constantly erased from Latin America throughout centuries. And it's so funny because of how much extractivism there is of our culture in Latin America. I call it extractivism because specifically in our lovely Latin America, everybody loves reggaeton, merengue, bachata, salsa, but they ignore or try to erase the black voices where they come from and even hate us. I mean, you just need to do a quick Google search to see how much aggressive anti-blackness and colorism there is in Latin America. Throughout decades, even though being one of the biggest migrant communities in New York City, Dominicans and their experiences are often ignored by the quote-unquote real Latino voices in the United States and Latino multimedia chains like Telemundo and Univision. Way before Gina Rodriguez said the N-word, she complained about Black Panther and Marvel and DC movies having no Latinos in the movies when there are black Latinos first and foremost. I saw myself in the movie Black Panther more than in her stupid and boring TV show Jane the Virgin, which, by the way, I personally believe is extremely problematic. How they perceive virginity and how they perceive certain things and the subtle slut shaming. But that's a topic for another episode. Another thing, John Leguizamo complained on 2020 about the lack of Latino representation in the Emmys, while sharing the screenshot of a news headline that said, Emmy 2020, Black nominees gain ground, Latino representation still abysmal. John Leguizamo used this screenshot to take Black people down. Like, if there are the problem when they were only 33% of the nominees. And also, ignoring that there are Black Latinos, especially since in 2019, the Dominican Jarrell Jerome was the first Afro-Latino to win an Emmy ever. Remember the infamous racist remarks the Venezuelan Rodner Figueroa made about Michelle Obama when he used to work at Univision? And it took decades for Telemundo and Univision to start hiring Dominicans and Black Latinos as part of their host and news anchor team. And they don't even have that many nowadays. I mean, there's a lot of raw anti-Blackness in Latin America after all. It is not weird that they will bring the racism they learn in their countries to the countries they decide to emigrate to. If we are all included and the fight is for everybody, then these questions and analysis should be welcome, not avoided. To decolonize the history of Latin America is to understand that La Latinidad is a colonial experiment that indigenous and Black communities between this quote-unquote brotherhood of nations are still dealing with the negative consequences to this day. An intersectional and decolonial analysis makes the fight against racism within the United States even stronger. And to bring valid points about a community that is full with colorism and racism makes that such fight way more stronger. The main reason why there's such a backlash for In the Heights is because this movie is the last straw of decades of constant erasure of Dominicans by the rest of the Latino community. These are my opinions, so please, again, don't take it personal, take a deep breath, take a seat. And I'm also not against people who enjoy the movie. There's nothing wrong with liking the movie or feeling a connection with it. So, without further ado, let's get into the movie. And of course, spoiler alert. I want to talk a little about the things I like. For example, I like the history arc of the Cuban grandmother, Abuela Claudia, and how she shared her experience as an immigrant. I really like her part in the train and the transitions between the dancers and in the train. This is my personal opinion, but her use of the English language and accent kind of got me out of the movie, like got me out of the immersion in the movie, but that's something I will discuss further. Also, I like the scene where Nina and Benny are singing, kind of at the end and walking on the wall. It wasn't super creative, but I thought it was really nice and cute, especially how they move their bodies. I felt their characters had genuine chemistry, and I wish they would have been the main characters in the movie. Visual-wise, the movie wasn't groundbreaking. I felt the same vibe as Crazy Rich Asians, and again, as I mentioned before, I didn't like that movie. So for me, the movie felt like a parody of a music video of what Latin music is in Hollywood sitcom. The music wasn't groundbreaking. I understand it's a musical and it's based on a Broadway musical, and I might be biased because I am Dominican, so was expecting certain type of music, and I also don't like musicals necessarily. But for me, the music was kind of forgettable and dull, and I was hoping they would have been explored more, like the Dominican music, since the musical was supposed to be about Dominican culture, you know? I think they sample a generic bachata for a few seconds, and of course dull generic merengue music that sounded that it was from stock music. So I didn't hear any good merengue, any good bachata, not even good dembow. And dembow is so important in Washington Heights. You know, and music is really important. A lot of Dominican artists go and play in New York, especially for the Dominican community, especially in Washington Heights, all the time. Like, there is music that becomes trendy before in New York than it becomes trendy in the Dominican Republic. The history arc in the movie was a little sloppy, and the plot was all over the place. I didn't see any character transformation from the main characters, which are Usnavi and Vanessa. There's a huge difference between the circumstances changing around you than you changing as a character together with the circumstances, or changing the world around you. And the rest of the characters didn't change that much either, except from Sonny, even though they portray his migration status situation in a very sloppy way. But again, I will discuss the political and social commentary further later in this episode. I liked Sonny's character, by the way. Going back to things I like about the movie, he was very fresh, he was very charismatic, he was very natural. I know those Dominican kids, but unfortunately I can't say the same about Usnavi and Vanessa. They didn't have chemistry, which made their love story arc feel a little forced. Usnavi's singing was alright, neither good or bad for my taste. Vanessa's singing was good, but neither hers nor Usnavi's dancing skills were that good either. After watching the movie, I'm convinced they casted these two unknown actors as the main characters just because they're light-skinned and white. So, the director's comments that they just picked the best for these roles and that colorism has nothing to do with it adds insult to injury. They could have casted Nina and Benny, the actors who play Nina and Benny, as the main characters instead of secondary, and at least the actress who plays Nina, Leslie Grace, she's Dominican. Her parents are Dominican, even though she was born in the States. And the actor who plays Benny, Corey Hawkins, is a way better singer than Anthony Torres, the guy who plays Usnavi. One of the main reasons why they are getting so much scrutiny is because they try to sell this musical as an honest, groundbreaking representation of the life and experience of people who live in the Washington Heights. That woke washing strategy worked when the director John M. Chu released the movie Crazy Rich Asians, but in this case it backfired. You either do it or just not do it at all. I understand it is a musical and musicals are not meant to be taken seriously. Therefore, they should have kept it simple, corny, and cute. They should have done it about a generic Latino neighborhood instead of making it based in a neighborhood where the majority of the population is not only Dominican but also Black Dominican, and just erase them completely. The movie invited this discussion, so they need to deal with the backlash and deal with it. In general, I felt like if I wasn't the target audience of the movie, I felt like if the target audience of the movie are either white people or non-black people in general, the movie wanted and tried to be political and bring tough issues, but it felt short and would restrain itself in order to include white people as part of the audience. Like, for example, when Nina shared her experiences of racism and discrimination in Stanford University, or when Vanessa was trying to rent an apartment and she wasn't even considered because of where she comes from, housing discrimination, the topic of that part, or Sonny being an undocumented migrant, and also the long blackout that caused the death of Abuela Claudia. So what they did is they touched those issues in a very surface level, but in a way that wouldn't make white people feel uncomfortable, like they wouldn't go deeper or they would just drop it instead of going deeper into it. And don't get me wrong, I love goofy movies, but what they did is kind of insulting and they romanticize racism and discrimination. I know it's a musical, but the whole thing of let's dance our way through institutional racism feels weird in a film that changes its tone so much, you can't start the movie by saying this is the story of a blog that was disappearing and expect people not to expect the movie to touch those issues with at least some consistency between the plot. Now, let's talk about the blackout. So there's a blackout that happens in the movie, and the blackout is presented in a way like with a lot of expectation, like 2 days until the blackout, 3 days until the blackout, etc. And the blackout situation left me with a lot of questions. I wish I knew the reason of such a long blackout, for example. We know there's an institutional racism element in the reason why certain neighborhoods lack certain services. If you're bringing something like that and even make it the cause of the death of an important character like Abuela Claudia, at least be brave enough to dedicate 2 minutes or 30 seconds or even 5 seconds to explain why is there a blackout in the neighborhood. You don't have to explain it directly to the audience and break the fourth wall. You could have a character make a comment about it. And how they brought gentrification, it was so funny. They mentioned it a few times, but again, weren't brave enough to discuss it or even use the word gentrification or even at least say it again 10 minutes because, okay, why are you losing the neighborhood? When I mean discuss, I don't mean to sit and talk about it. As I mentioned before, they could have made a musical number about it instead of mention it and pretend if it doesn't exist or if it's an abstract quote unquote problem, or just don't bring it up at all. I'm not asking for pain and injustice. I don't watch movies that depict racism and pain on black and people of color and minorities in general. That's not what I'm asking. I'm just asking for consistency in the plot. Now, let's talk about representation. Keep in mind that more than half of the population of Washington Heights is Dominican. The main character is Dominican, and the Dominican representation was lacking. There are Dominicans who look like Usnavi, including Dominicans who live in New York, but then why not cast Dominican actors as the main characters? Or, since the majority of Dominicans who live in Washington Heights are black, why not black people at least? They had Dasha Polanco in the movie. She is Dominican. She's way more famous than the main actors. She's a proper Dominican Yol. Why not casting her as the main actress? I mean, even most of the characters in the movie weren't Dominicans, and without counting the extras, there were only 2 Dominican actors with some sort of dialogue in the whole movie. Dasha Polanco, who spoke very, very few times, and Leslie Grace. The actress who played Vanessa, Melissa Barrera, is a white girl from Monterrey. I didn't see enough Dominican businesses. Usnavi's bodega didn't look like a Dominican bodega. I was like, where are the bodega cats? Bodega cats are an important part of Dominican bodegas in New York City. They even have their own Wikipedia article. There was no Dominican food, no Dominican restaurants. The nightclub looked like a stereotypical Latin music nightclub in a white American movie where the white woman goes to discover herself after divorcing her boring husband. They showed a Dominican barbershop for 4 seconds in the montage at the beginning of the movie. Maybe I'm being nitpicky with the details, but I'm just doing what the movie told us, the audience, to consider important. One of the key phrases they say in the movie is, "Little details that tell the world we're not invisible," which is quite ironic since they just erased Dominicans in a movie about Dominicans. The Dominican representation in a movie about a Dominican community is quite lacking. And I'm not against people playing other nationalities, but as I mentioned before, the problem is that there's always an excuse of not including Dominicans in Latino productions. So why not using a story about Dominicans to give more opportunities to Dominican actors, or to do an honest representation of Dominican culture in the Washington Heights, or at least try, or a story set up in a neighborhood where the majority of the population is black Dominicans to include more black Latinos. Now, let's talk about the parts of the movie that's being discussed the most. Colorism. As I explained before, there are Dominicans who look like Usnavi and Vanessa, but why are the majority of the main cast non-black? But what about the rest of the cast? Even Sonny's dad was Mark Anthony. Couldn't they have a famous Dominican musician like Romeo Santos to do that cameo instead? And even among extras, the majority were light-skinned. There were some parts that they showed black people in a negative way, like the men who catcalled Vanessa in a scene, they were black. And also in a scene they showed a dark-skinned woman as loud, angry, and vulgar. I mean, she was right on getting angry in that scene because Vanessa fucked her hair. Lin-Manuel Miranda plays the role of a piragüero. It's quite small, but in a scene, they show how he struggles to survive because the kids prefer the ice cream truck. So the ice cream guy is portrayed in a very caricature style villain way who enjoys seeing the poor piragüero struggle. And coincidentally, the evil ice cream guy is black. They also show one shoplifter, and he's also black. Now I want to talk about the black Dominican graffiti artist. His character for me was quite interesting, but sadly because of the wrong reasons. So he likes to graffiti around the neighborhood, and at the beginning he vandalizes Usnavi's business. So even though at the end he kind of redeems himself, but it's so funny because they don't show him as this talented guy, which is funny because the producers, they use a lot of graffiti and street art in the movie as part of the aesthetic in the movie. So Miss Vanessa is some sort of aspiring clothes designer, and she's kind of in a creative block, which sometimes gets solved when she grabs inspiration from her environment. But one day she walks by Graffiti Pete, which is the black Dominican who graffitis around the neighborhood, and she gets inspiration from his used rags to create more designs. Graffiti Pete was such a wasted opportunity, because how many kids we know who are like him, who find inspiration within their neighborhood and create things that are groundbreaking but that are also a little against the norm. I also personally noticed a color hierarchy in the movie. Of course, Mark Anthony's character as Sonny's dad is a horrible person who doesn't care about his child, but keep in mind, Mark Anthony's cameo was a fan service, and in a movie with so little black representation, I mean, it was fair that they would have a light-skinned Puerto Rican play a horrible character. Now, I want to talk again about Cuca, who's played by Dasha Polanco. Even though she's not dark-skinned, they turn her character into the stereotype of the black woman with sexy curves who is very sensual and works in a salon, who's very simple. Her character is not very deep. There's nothing wrong with being sensual and curvy. Again, the thing is, Dasha Polanco is more famous than Melissa, which is the actress who plays Vanessa. Why did they have Dasha Polanco play such a small part in the movie? Is it because the producers and the director, they felt her black Dominican looks didn't fit into the Washington Heights aesthetic they were trying to create? They even gave more depth to the two other girls who work with her in the salon, and it's so okay, this part, oh my god, this part. One of the characters, Daniela, had the audacity of saying, "Our people survived slave ships, we survived Taino genocide." And I'm like, excuse me, Miss Daniela, but who are we? The movie can't just throw a line like that and expect people with common sense not to react and bring up the colorism and representation issues in the movie. You're being colorist in the movie and have the audacity to mention our enslaved ancestors? You just erase Dominicans in their own community and dare to bring up Taino genocide? That was another way of not only whitewashing the history of colonialism in Latin America, but also another way to create a confusing mixture of concepts and ideas that have nothing to do with each other. It was like an arroz con mango being cooked by someone who don't know how to cook at all and has never seen mango or rice in their life before. Let's talk a little about the production and aftermath of the movie. So the movie, as some of you know, is based on a musical with music and lyrics by Lin-Manuel Miranda and a book by Kiara Alegría Hoods. Kiara is a white woman from Pennsylvania with a Puerto Rican mother who grew up in Philadelphia. Couldn't find more information about her background, but she studied composition at Yale University, and she's a visiting professor at Wesleyan University in Connecticut. Again, I haven't seen the Broadway musical, so I can't give any comments on it, but I mean, why would someone with no connections with the Latino community in New York, let alone the Dominican community in Washington Heights, makes a musical about that community? I couldn't even find any information about her having lived in New York before creating this musical, and I googled some photos of the Broadway production of In the Heights, and actually the cast is For what I've seen in the photos, of course. Again, as I'm saying, I haven't watched the musical, but the cast, it looks even more whitewashed than the movie version. Lin-Manuel Miranda, he's a household name. He's very famous. He's a successful actor, especially for the Broadway musical In the Heights and Hamilton. He was born in New York City in an upper middle class family of Puerto Rican background. His family is very successful and rich back in Puerto Rico. It was a very smart move from the movie production company to have him so involved in the production of In the Heights. The Broadway and off-Broadway versions of the musical have been extremely successful, winning awards and with shows outside of the United States. Lin-Manuel and Kiara have made a lot of money from a community they know nothing about. I'm not surprised at all In the Heights is so problematic because it has been since its creation. And of course, the movie was filmed in Washington Heights, but they sold that as something extremely groundbreaking and as part of them being such a truthful story that wants to do an honest representation of the community in the neighborhood. So for this part, I need you to be ready because it is going to be a wild ride. In an interview with Oprah Winfrey back in June the 8th, in her show Oprah Daily's Blog Party, director John Chu emphasized the importance of filming the movie where it actually takes place. And now I will quote things the director of Washington Heights, John Chu, said to Oprah. I hope you're sitting because you will listen. The best choice we made was shooting in Washington Heights. It was like writing a love letter while falling in love. Shooting this movie gave us all life. We often don't pay attention to the bodega owner or the piragua guy. There's no such thing as a small story. We need to tell the story of that guy, that woman, this family. We should look up to them because they're fighting hard. They're doing all the things that we say is American. I felt in love with the neighborhood that Lin and Kiara showed me around. The neighborhood of dreaming and looking beyond your windowsill and knowing there's a world there for you. I wanted to say Heights every day of my life, and I wanted my son to hear that. Oh, I need a break. I don't even know where to start with this huge pile of bullcrap, but you just can't say that. You just can't pretend you're deeper than what you actually are and then be surprised when people question the lack of representation. The director said he doesn't only deserve the backlash, but he is inviting the backlash when he pretends to be something he's not. As I mentioned before at the beginning of this review, why didn't you just keep it cute, simple, and short? Lin-Manuel Miranda gave an apology, and to be honest, I read it and I felt like if he just doesn't get it. Which is funny because he showed himself as a Washington Heights expert. And a lot of non-black Latinos have defended the movie, and pretty much they just tell people who bring these concerns up to be quiet and celebrate this movie as an accomplishment instead of being a hater. And to them I say, no, we will not be quiet. We have the right to express our concerns about how we get constantly erased. Enough is enough. If you're taking our experiences and have the audacity to erase us, at least be quiet and deal with the backlash. Imagine that someone is doing a movie about the history of lasagna, but instead of including lasagna, they include a can of generic ravioli. And then you ask, why don't they just do a movie about the history of canned ravioli instead? Because that's not lasagna. But the filmmakers of the lasagna movie insist that it doesn't matter because it's the same since they're both pasta. And then you do your research and find out that the person in charge of writing the script for the movie has never seen lasagna in her life, has never met anyone who knows how to cook lasagna, and she thought that homemade lasagna and canned ravioli are the same thing. So for her, that's enough to write a book about lasagna. That is In the Heights. The movie In the Heights is that canned ravioli. Thank you for watching and thank you for listening to this very special episode. I did my best, and I know there's a lot more to discuss about the production of the company, like how long it took because of some production issues, how they thought about casting Shakira and Jennifer Lopez, etc. Thank you so much for listening and watching again. Please support this project by subscribing, commenting, and sharing, and tell me what you think in the comment section below. Is there something I missed? Did you like the movie? Why not? What was your favorite part of the movie? What was your least favorite part of the movie? Are you planning on watching the movie after this review, etc.? Follow me on Instagram, where I am super active, and you can also find me in most podcast platforms, including Spotify and Apple Podcasts. I am also on Patreon, where I have exclusive content and special benefits for my lovely patrons, and I'm gonna have some special content from this episode included in my Patreon. Don't forget to subscribe, don't forget to comment, don't forget to share. Thank you so much, and this is Mango Podcast.